Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer, the host of this show, and I am so excited to let you know that our next virtual conference is September 26th and 27th, 2024. I'll be sharing more information with you about this in the middle of this podcast and would recommend that you sign up now. The link for signing up for the conference is lnc.tips/September 2024 virtual. Now, let's get started. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. Today, we're going to focus on one of the most frequently requested services for legal nurse consultants, and that is to create chronologies. They can be used in a variety of cases for a variety of purposes. This episode of Legal Nurse Podcast will focus on the usefulness of chronologies and leave you with some tips that you can apply to the next chronology that you work on. We have now given at least 609 episodes of this show to our subscribers, and we thank you for being here. We have listeners now in 107 countries, and we welcome your comments and thoughts. If you go to podcast.legalnursebusiness.com, you'll see on the homepage, there's a spot for you to leave a message and tell us your thoughts. I'd like to introduce to you our guest, who is a registered nurse with a master's degree, who works clinically in acute care. She's been working in acute care for her entire nursing career. And for the last dozen or more years, since 2009, she's been working for a case management company, heavily focused on doing chronologies, primarily for personal injury cases. In addition to her work for the company, she also has an independent LNC business and provides case reviews for medical malpractice cases, with an emphasis on acute care, med-surg, nursing malpractice cases. Mary Beth Kerstein is our guest. Mary Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pat, for having me this afternoon.
I mentioned in the beginning that this is one of the most frequently requested services from attorneys. What are the benefits to an attorney from having an LNC prepare a chronology?
Benefits of the legal nurse preparing the chronology. He or she is going to give you a detailed summary of the pertinent part of the medical records, the patient's diagnosis, symptoms, treatments, and responses. It's not just a regurgitation of the medical records, but it's giving you the pertinent analysis and findings that's hidden within those medical records.
And I know a question that commonly comes up is, what kind of software should I use to create a chronology?
Well, you can use Word, you can use Excel, you can use Case Map. For my 20 years of experience, I've used Word, and it's worked out just fine for me. You can do a table format or narrative format. Pat, I know you've had some experience with Excel and Case Map.
People have asked me about using Excel because it seems like a logical choice since it already has columns and you can adjust the size of the columns. But in my experience, Excel works best if it's used for numbers rather than words. Its spell checking capabilities don't parallel what's available on Microsoft Word, and it can be klutzier to format. You have to always remember to wrap around the words on the columns, otherwise they disappear. So I don't recommend it as the primary tool that you should consider. I have used Case Map, and I've used it at a time when you could purchase it outright, and then I've also used it at a time when it has to be leased. Most software companies have gone to the leasing model so they can charge you per year for using the product. And it has an advantage that you put entries in and it automatically sorts it in chronological order, which Word does not do automatically. You can sort it, but it doesn't automatically put it in the right spot. And you can also use short codes. For example, if you're referring to a physician and her name is Dr. Steinwagen, you can type Dr. capital S, and then it will fill in Steinwagen for you so that you don't have to type long names. You can do the same thing in Word, by the way, by doing a search and replace with Dr. S asterisk, and then replace it with Dr. Steinwagen, and it goes through like magic and replaces all those entries. Talking about keeping entries in order, why is that so critical when you're creating a chronology?
It's critical to keep it in chronological order so you can see the dates when symptoms started, when new diagnoses are identified, and when there's exacerbations in the condition, and when the traumatic event has an impact. You're looking for changes. So having your entries in the chronological order help tremendously with finding those changes.
And I've been asked by inexperienced LNCs, well, suppose I have records from 3 providers and they overlap. Do I put all the records from one provider into the chronology in chronological order and then move on to the next provider and start a new section of the chronology, or do I do it differently?
I love to start with whatever the event is. If it was a car crash, I like to start with that date and look at the police report or the accident report for that. Otherwise, the rest of the medical records, it doesn't matter. I just start reading them and plugging in the information into the appropriate spot. You just insert a row above or below and have the time there. If it's physical therapy notes, you may group those together. But otherwise, your doctor's office visits, your ER visits, hospitalizations, and surgeries, you're going to have those all as their own entry in your chronology.
So if I understand you correctly, if the patient went to see Dr. Steinberger on Tuesday, August 17th, and then went to see Dr. Watson on August 19th, and then went back to Steinberger in September, that they are kept in chronological order, even if they are seeing different providers within that time frame.
Yes, you would have 3 separate entries and they'd each be specific. So Dr. Steinberger, his first date, that Dr. Watson, and then Dr. Steinberger again. So you could see those chronological orders to see what changes one provider might have noticed that the other didn't notice.
Now you've told the attorney, it looks like the patient was referred to Dr. Peoplemaker, and you don't have Dr. Peoplemaker's records. The attorney gets them for you. Now you've got a document where Dr. Peoplemaker's entries are, in essence, needing to be integrated into that chronology, which you'll hand over to the attorney, who will say, well, Mary Beth, how do I know what's new? And how do I know what I've already looked at?
Well, what I find very helpful is the whole chronology and initial chronology is in black font. When I go to update it, when additional records come in, at the top of the report, I put updated, the date, and I put that in blue font. And then any new entries that I put into the report are also highlighted in blue font, so the attorney can pick up and see what's changed. Say a couple months later, they give you some new records, you change everything again to black font, and then you're going to put updated with the date at the top in blue font, and then the new entries again in blue font. So each report would be dated at the top when the report was completed, and then any updates would be in blue font that would be changed each time. So that way the attorney doesn't have to read through the whole report if they just want to see what new information has been added in and where it fits into the events of the timeline.
Yes. I have done something similar in the past. I have highlighted a row in a different color. I did learn in the process of working on chronologies that I made an assumption that law firms were equipped with color printers, and I discovered that that was not the case. I also discovered it when I was doing expert fact witness cases, and I had beautiful medication tables showing which drugs the patient got on which days to control pain. But in black and white, they all turn into shades of gray, and all those beautiful colors disappear. So that's one consideration. Don't make an assumption that your reports will print out in color. On the screen, it'll look fine, but on paper, it may be harder to differentiate.
If you're using just the two colors, just the black font for your original and the blue font for your update, it still prints, and then there's only one thing that would be in a little bit lighter gray, versus if you added each new update into a different rainbow color.
Yes, yes, which is what we're not recommending that you do. There are some challenges in creating chronologies. Could you touch on some of the ones that you've encountered?
Some of the chronologies would be missing records. You may have a document and some pertinent pages are missing off a diagnostic study. An operative report, page 2 out of 3 is missing. Post-operative vital signs, and some of those pages might be missing from your document. Or there may be discrepancies. There may be 2 versions of the same document that are filed that you may come across. Sometimes you'll have handwritten entries. Luckily, when I started years ago, it was all handwritten, but now not as many of the documents are handwritten. So sometimes trying to figure out what those handwritten entries are. And then sometimes they use unofficial abbreviations in the charting. And that's where the LNC can be very helpful because you do have that expertise of reading the notes and knowing what different the abbreviations are without having to look them all up.
The Joint Commission, which accredits many of the hospitals and other healthcare facilities in the United States, made a somewhat futile effort of recommending that every hospital follow an approved list of abbreviations. And I discovered that even though they made some recommendations, which were soundly based on potential for errors, like not abbreviating morphine as MSO4 when it could also be interpreted as mag sulfate. Abbreviations sneak into a hospital through residents who come, through new attendings who join the staff, through new nurses who come on, and they start using abbreviations which people in the facility understand, but we might not understand. So that can be a challenge, and it's like there's a game on the boardwalk in New Jersey called Whack-A-Mole. It may be in carnivals as well. There's this little head of a toad that comes up through a hole, and you pay your admission fee to get a mallet, and you try to whack the mole on the head. It's a very violent game. And try to hit it before it disappears and pops up somewhere else. So when we talk about whack-a-mole, we talk about trying to stamp out a practice that just keeps creeping back in to use. You've got a whole bunch of medical records now, Mary Beth, and how do you know what's pertinent to focus on when you do the chronology? Before we continue,
have you been thinking about other career opportunities in nursing? I'd like to say that the sky is the limit. There are so many opportunities, and the one that I want to share with you is about the field of legal nurse consulting. It is such an exciting one where you can work directly with attorneys, on the forefront, or even behind the scenes. I have so much more to share with you. My colleague and dear friend, Patricia Iyer, and I are excited to offer our 10th virtual Legal Nurse Conference. We have new speakers and new topics. Some of the topics include how to attract the ideal clients. So if you are brand new in the field of legal nursing, you certainly want to tune in and learn how to attract the ideal clients. How to master marketing essentials. This is great for every level legal nurse consultant. And an attorney is going to share the most significant case of his entire career. We will also share with you an actual case. We are going to bring this case to light. The attorney and a legal nurse consultant who work together are going to share and go in depth and give you the opportunity to work on this case. Great time ahead. Right now, I am here to introduce to you Mary Beth Kerstein, and she is one of our speakers. She is going to be on the panel with the topic of lessons learned from the legal nurse consultant. She is an MSN, BSN, RN, ONC from Milford, Michigan, and her career has spanned over 38 years. She's clinically active and has worked in the hospital setting her entire career. She has had multiple roles, and in addition to this, she is a very successful legal nurse consultant. She has worked behind the scenes with attorneys and paralegals, as well as served as an expert witness. Today, she is going to share a little bit about what her panel topic will be. Welcome, Mary Beth.
Thank you, Barbara, for inviting me to join you tonight. I'm really excited about our upcoming presentation in September. My legal nurse consulting career started 20 years ago when I heard a defense attorney present at the hospital how to protect yourself with your documentation. After the presentation, I met with the attorney and started working there part-time at the defense firm. One of my most memorable cases is when they asked me to develop a chronology, which I'll always refer to as my Mr. Bleeding chronology. This poor gentleman had an elective surgery and he did not survive. He bled out. That was the short version of it. So when I finished my chronology, I immediately went to the attorney. I said, I know I'm new here. I'm sure you're not going to want to hear this, but you need to break out the checkbook right now and find out how to settle this case. He goes, very good. Nope, that's not what I wanted to hear, but thank you for telling me. And I showed him where the important details. So I was took from there on. And 20 years later, I'm still doing all kinds of fun, exciting things in the legal nurse consulting world. Most of my experience has been behind the scenes, and there is so much you can do. You want to attend our conference and learn about all the different roles and opportunities you can. And there's just so much information.
Thank you so much. And I know that all of our attendees who are beginner, advanced, and even the most experienced will learn so much from you and the other panel members, as well as the attorneys, legal nurses, and others who are going to be presenting at our conference. So we want you to join us September 26 and 27, 2024 for our 10th virtual live Legal Nurse Consulting Conference. This is going to be a really exciting one. Please see the link below, lnc.tips/September 2024 virtual. We look forward to seeing you.
How to find out what's pertinent, you really need to speak with the attorney and find out what the case focuses it about. Is it a personal injury case where you're looking for damages? Is it a medical malpractice case where you're looking for the events or series of events that led to the complications? Or is it a criminal defense case where you're looking for alternative causations for the patient's situation? So finding out from the attorney what their case focus and their theory is really is a starting point that's critical, along with finding out how detailed of a report the attorney's looking for and what the anticipated length of the report they're looking for. Are they looking for a 5-page report, 20-page, 100-page that's extremely detailed? It's important to find that out before you spend the time on that report development.
That's a common complaint I have heard from inexperienced LNCs who do an absolutely exquisitely detailed chronology and then present the attorney with a magnificent bill for multiple dozens of hours. And the attorney says, what? I never expected this size invoice. What did you do? Have you heard of stories of people who have been caught up in that trap?
Well, I've heard many stories about it. Unfortunately, that you don't want to put all that time into doing that if that's not what they're looking for. luckily I get feedback on my reports and what they're anticipating and what type of work product is needed. It really makes a difference, but it is a trap, particularly for a new legal nurse consultant who's not sure how much time to put into the report. And each attorney is going to be different on what their expectations are, not just in overall, but for each specific case, what they're looking for.
How do we know what their expectations are?
You have to ask them. You can ask them if they have a sample report format that they like. You can show them a couple of your sample reports and ask them what their preference is and how detailed they're asking. But you're only going to know from communication with that attorney client, or if you're working for a case management firm for the CEO of that company, you know, what they're anticipating if you're not speaking directly with the attorney client. Or the subcontractor, if you're working for a subcontractor, finding out from them what the detailed and expectations are. So whoever your client is.
Yes. And I suppose it could also be helpful to see a sample of what the attorney is used to receiving, or discuss how much detail, what columns. Sometimes chronologies are given to expert witnesses, and that's something that you need to know before you work on it, because you might be inserting opinions or comments into a chronology, which then gets turned over to an expert witness. I know as an expert witness, I have gotten chronologies prepared by in-house staff, and invariably the opposing counsel will ask in deposition, did you rely on this chronology? And the answer always has to be, no, I did my own independent review of the records. So that's another factor to know how opinions should or not be included in a chronology, or perhaps in a separate report, an analysis report, where you can offer pertinent comments and focus on the things that are relevant to the attorney, but not necessarily by inserting those comments in the chronology. Is that something that you have done in your practice?
Definitely. With the majority of the chronologies that I develop for the case management firm, the chronologies are shared. There's no comments. It's just the facts, the pertinent facts that I abstract out of the medical records. The chronologies are given to all of the healthcare providers. They are given to the insurance company. They're given to the case management team so they know what to work on. And then if there's an attorney on the case, it's also shared with the attorney. Those chronologies are used in depositions, they're used in trial, so there are no comments on those. I've done some other chronologies for other subcontractors where they wanted me to highlight the different things, what are causation factors, what are pre-existing conditions, and other red topics, critical topics to discuss, where I've had to highlight that. I've done some subcontracting work where they wanted a separate column with your nurse comments on the side, where you put in explanations of the medical terms, different pictures of the body parts. So it just depends on each client what they're looking for and what extras you may put in there. But majority of the ones I do for the personal injury cases have it just totally objective with no comments, and then I do a separate report with the detailed areas of red flags, discrepancies, items to request for further updates, and any care items that I think need to be addressed. So that's in a separate email.
That's a great practice, because you can still convey the results of your analytical review of this content and not put it in a document where it would fall in the hands of people who should not see it. As we think about, for example, traumatic injury cases, because you've mentioned you've worked on several of those, what kinds of records would an LNC expect to receive for that type of a case?
Well, if you read the book that got published last November, I wrote a chapter called The Top 20 Records to Review in a Traumatic Injury Case. So that would have all 20 records in there that I recommend. But you're always going to want to have the incident report, which is either the accident report, the police report, incident report, You're going to want to take a look at any EMS transportation if they went by BLS, ACLS, flight, ER records. You're going to look at the hospitalization records, any operative reports, diagnostic studies, physician progress notes, the physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and nursing notes, because you're going to actually find a lot of information in those details. You're going to want to request the primary care provider records so you can see what the baseline condition was, what their pre-existing status was, and then any follow-up notes so you can see any changes that happened as a result of the traumatic event. If they have extended problems and they need to go to a physical medicine and rehab physician, PT, OT, outpatient, if they had orthopedic injuries, if they have psychological coping problems that were resulted from their event, they may have psychology, neuropsychology, psychiatric notes. If they had facial trauma, they may need oral surgery follow-up or dental follow-up. So it just depending on what type of injury they had as a result of their case. And there's more, but those are the main highlights. The primary care providers, the EMS, the ER, the hospitalization, and any follow-up consultants would be your minimum records that you're going to want to have.
And I have seen attorneys who assume that the EMS records are part of the emergency department records, and they are not. You're shaking your head no. They have to be requested separately, and sometimes there's a basic life support and an advanced life support records. In some places, they call them mobile intensive care unit records. The fire department might be the one that issues the first ambulance that comes to the scene, and then they bring in the mobile intensive care unit. Sometimes there's air transport records from helicopters or fixed wing planes, a new phrase that I like to play with. So all of those are important to include. And you mentioned the chapter in the book. For those who are not familiar, Mary Beth contributed a chapter to my book, Medical Record Analysis, which is available on my website at lnc.tips/creating series. Those books are books that I've either written or edited, and the Medical Record Analysis book has many chapters in both Volume 1 and Volume 2 that were written by legal nurse consultants. You mentioned the psychological trauma, Mary Beth, and I want to focus on that just for a minute, about some of the invisible injuries that might occur after a traumatic event. Can you shed a little bit light on what are the points that LNC should be looking for when they're going through records after a person sustained some type of a traumatic event?
Sure, you're going to look for some of those invisible injuries. You can see the orthopedic abrasions, fractures, burns, and other traumas. But the pain that the person is suffering from, the psychological trauma, the PTSD, anxiety, depression, adjustment, coping disorders that they're having make a definite impact on the recovery. And sometimes those can last for months or years after the event that they suffered. I just submitted the chapter to Pat, my draft version, waiting for this next book that'll be coming out. And my title is Shining the Light on the Neuropsychological Effects of Trauma.
And often underappreciated in terms of their existence or severity. We mentioned as we were talking about the use of the chronology, we talked about creating a separate analytical report or letter or email to the attorney pointing out some of the significant details that are in a chronology. As next to the last question for you, what additional reports could we provide on top of the chronology and that separate analysis? We talked about preparing a chronology and preparing a separate report that would include some of the salient details that you can provide to the attorney, opinions, thoughts, observations, that you would not include in a chronology. What else could you do for the attorney?
I like to also create what I call a diagnosis grid report, which is a focused timeline, just looking at the specific diagnoses. So it drills down the information from the chronology into just looking at the diagnoses. Sometimes I'll create what I call a diagnostic testing grid if they had numerous diagnostic studies done, so that they can see the different changes from that. You can do medication profiles, you can do medical summaries, you can do timelines, you can do focused reports, you can do a pain and suffering report. There's a lot of different additional reports, but and email summary also of the red flags, discrepancies, records to be obtained, and areas to be concerned about. You either do that by phone or in a separate document, but not inside your objective chronology. Sometimes they also do medication profiles if they want to see what medications they were taking before and after the event, dosage changes, prescribers, and a review of that. And also listing of the provider lists and how they're relevant to the case. And then also looking at possible deposition questions that they need to ask of providers.
Wow, that's a lot of additional services, and probably attorneys don't even think about them when they say, Mary Beth, can you do a chronology for me, as a way of carrying the attorney's understanding even deeper. You can volunteer some of these additional reports that might be useful. Or as a value added, for example, doing a cast of characters, the list of providers is something that you could do as an add-on to your chronology to help the attorney understand things, or a glossary of terms that enhance the attorney's understanding, but don't take a long time to put together because you're already working through the records and can have a separate document open with the name of the provider and the type of specialty so that the attorney can quickly figure out who's who. I know that we have sparked questions in our audience's mind. How can they best reach you, Mary Beth?
They can best reach me on LinkedIn if they want to learn a little bit more about me. I'm on there, and it's linkedin.com and /in/my name, Mary Beth Kerstein, or they can reach me by email at mbkerstein@comcast.net. I work nights, so I will respond to you within 24 hours, but I may be asleep on some of the days if you're trying to call me.
Understood. Thank you so much, Mary Beth, for sharing your thoughts. You've given us a lot of good tips on creating chronologies, how they're used, why they're used, how to integrate new information in. I know that our listeners will have gotten a lot of value from the tips that you've shared today. For you who has been listening to this podcast on the audio channels or watching it on our YouTube channel for Legal Nurse Business, thanks for being with us. Stay connected with us for another couple minutes when you find out what's coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. I'll see you then. Coming up next, you'll have an opportunity to meet a pediatric nurse practitioner who has dedicated a portion of her life to being involved in helping to analyze criminal cases. She has particular expertise in child abuse and child neglect. We focused our podcast on that topic, and I'd like you, Katie, to tell our listener a little bit about what we covered in your podcast.
Absolutely. We went over the risk factors for child abuse, talking about the definition of child abuse, the different subsets of that, and child neglect, including Munchausen's by proxy. Talked about the common injuries, fractures that you'd see, head injuries, and medical etiologies or cultural practices that would be an explanation for injuries that would be suspicious for abuse. We talked about medical record red flags, things to look for, torn frenulums, and shaken baby.
There are a lot of things that legal nurse consultants can do to help in these types of cases. It requires analytical skills, a knowledge of anatomy, growth and development, normal milestones. This is an area where LNCs can shine in helping attorneys handling these cases. And Katie's podcast gives you a head start on some of the more common types of abuse and explains your role and some of the critical things that we can do to help attorneys with our understanding that goes beyond theirs. Be sure to come back to Legal Nurse Podcast or click on down to listen to the next episode of Legal Nurse Podcast with Katie Holmes. I'll see you there. That's it for today's episode of Legal Nurse Podcast. Be sure to go to the link that I've shared with you, lnc.tips/September 2024 virtual. Get your ticket now and block the time off on your calendar to join us for 2 packed days of education, support, and networking. Join us then.